I'd like to start with you, Donna. You held a congressional seat for many years, campaigned to return famously in your RV, going door to door in your district. You were in your party's leadership structure while in office. Now you are vice chair of the Association of Former Members of Congress. As a former public official and leader, still a leader really, what makes you so concerned about the prospect of political violence in this coming year?
First of all, thanks so much to the Kettering Foundation for inviting us for this really important conversation. You know, I talk to a number of my former colleagues all the time. We have dinner, we have conversations. What makes me concerned is what I hear from them, that they're frightened, that in their districts there's an elevated level of violence and threats, that they have changed their behavior as members of Congress in terms of the way that they reach out and connect with their constituents, and that this issue of threats, of violence, happens all the time. It isn't a random occurrence. I know when I was in Congress that we would get threats, report them to the Capitol Police, there'd be an investigation, officers might go out to visit the household, but they were at a distance. And now it seems that at least the threats of violence, and I think there's a thin line between a threat and then something that becomes an action. And when you look at the numbers of Americans who believe that violence is an appropriate response to a policy difference, to an election, that's frightening, where it may have been kind of under the covers and probably always there in the among the public, that today those ideas are held by fully a quarter of Americans, that they tend more to be held on the right than the left, but no one is immune. And I think that we have to take all of this really seriously, and frankly, what happened on January 6th is evidence of that. And when I think back to that day and witnessing, all of us looking at that on television as it unfolded, those are the doors at the Capitol where you go into the hallmark of our democracy, and it is now acceptable to threaten our institutions in that way, and views that are held by such a significant majority of our neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Let me shift over to Alex Theodoridis for a moment to respond to that. You're one of the national experts on political violence. You wrote what I think is the seminal paper on dehumanizing rhetoric, minted from UVA, Berkeley, go Bears, and Harvard, and you helped found the UVA Center for Politics, so I guess we have you to blame for Larry Sabato. As co-director of the UMass Amherst poll, you see a massive amount of survey data. What do we need to know about political violence?
Yeah, like Donna, I'm very concerned about the violence itself and the consequences of the violence in terms of behavior, people choosing to participate or not, choosing to run for office or not, choosing to be election officials or not. I'm very concerned about that. From a public opinion perspective, I'm extremely concerned about the people who aren't committing the violence, because still violence, mercifully is rare in American politics, but we have a lot of people out there who are tacitly endorsing violence. Some of them are elites, and obviously the rest of us take our cues from elites, usually elected officials, and that tacit endorsement is what really can sort of feed this ramp up to electoral violence at a level that would make January 6th seem like nothing. And that's really what concerns me, because that's where you would see all the research suggests that when we have elites using dehumanizing rhetoric, as you mentioned, endorsing violence, saying things like, well, we've just had the perpetrators of January 6th called hostages, that this was just a protest is sort of a common refrain out there. The average voter needs to hear, the average citizen needs to hear from elites on their own side that these things are not okay, that political violence is never okay. And if they don't hear that, then you go down this road of just different realities on both sides, and it can lead to a very, very dangerous place in terms of proliferating the kind of violence we've seen just a tad of.
Mm-hmm. Congresswoman, can I come back to you and just ask you, and I'm going off script here, so I hope you all can bear with me. Just reflect on the leadership role, the in-party leadership role of leaders in either accelerating or tamping down the threat of political violence. And then I'm going to ask you a question now.
Well, we've seen that as evidence coming out of January 6th. You will recall that there are a number of January 6th defendants who in their statements to the court said that they were inspired, and felt encouraged by the former president to engage in their criminal behavior on January 6th. We've heard from leadership most recently from the former president. From what was really disturbing to me is listening to the third-ranking Republican in the House, Elise Stefanik of New York, echo the description of January 6th defendants as hostages. And I think that this is, I mean, in so many ways, I mean, this kind of language actually gives permission to those who might engage in violence to take it from, you know, if they believe that they're righteous and just, then there is nothing that prevents them from engaging in criminal and violent behavior. It's a permission slip. And leadership matters. I mean, part of the reason that we've seen leaders, for example, when other violence has taken place, leaders go to the floor of the House, or they stand in front of a camera and they decry that violence. And unfortunately, that is not what we're seeing from so many leaders who are giving permission on their behalf for that kind of action. That, I think, is more disturbing, because if our leaders are going to do that, then there's nothing stopping an ordinary citizen acting on their own from engaging in behavior. Not necessarily organized action, but individuals who take it upon themselves to act out that violence. And let me just close here. Over this holiday season, the swatting that has taken place of not just elected officials, but volunteer poll workers and others is more evidence of that individual actors believe that they have the permission to engage in this behavior, not even orchestrated or coordinated in any fashion.
Can I just add on?
You
to
may.
That?
I have no control.
It's particularly important in terms of this responsibility of elites, both elected officials, people in the media. It's particularly important that people hear this from their own side in this polarized world, and that's partly the problem that we have. We have an asymmetric elite failure to really push back against the kind of language, the kind of behavior that is just unacceptable and ends up being not just a threat of violence, but part of democratic backsliding. Violence itself is a component of democratic backsliding, or can be.
Alan Jenkins, professor of practice at Harvard Law, focusing on race, the Supreme Court, and communications. You've explored this topic in a very interesting way I want to describe. But you've got an amazing career in government, in the Solicitor General's office, in philanthropy at Ford Foundation, associate counsel at NAACP's Legal Defense Education Fund, but more recently, you've thought about this topic of political violence in the form of a graphic novel. I have your most recent one here, second edition of 1/6, which Kettering is proud to be part supporter of. But this is really an alternative future, a speculative future of really the story is what if 1/6 had succeeded. Could you describe a little bit, and you didn't start like just now, you started a while ago, right? So describe your state of mind and what was on your mind when you began this project, and maybe contrast that with how you're feeling now today, January 9, 2024 in Washington, D.C.
Well, so first, thank you to the Kettering Foundation, both for having us here and for supporting the comic book series, available now on Amazon. And, like probably everybody in this room, I watched the events of January 6th, shocked but not completely surprised. Right? We saw the road to 1/6, and 1/6, of course, being the violence at the Capitol, the fake elector scheme, the strong-arming of local and harassment of local election officials and the Vice President of the United States. And so I was still shocked that it happened, but in many ways intellectually not surprised. I found myself waking up at 4 a.m. Morning after morning, worrying about our democracy. And as the other panelists have said, the fact that the forces that led to the violence that day had, if not remained the same, actually grown. The authoritarianism, the green light for political violence, the white supremacy and anti-Semitism that were the fuel for a lot of the violence that day had grown, and that the nation was already, and this was in the early days, already beginning to turn away from what had happened. This was before the wave of denialism and revisionism that we've seen since. And of course, we've seen that before in our nation's history. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, when the next wave was the retelling of the history of slavery and Reconstruction through lies and propaganda and the lost cause. And so, we could see, my co-writer, Gan Golan, and I could see where this was headed. And so, as a law professor, I could have written a law review article, which I've done, and it would have been read by tens of people in small rooms with, pointy heads. But I wanted to reach a much broader audience and hopefully actually engage and persuade people who were skeptical, who were disconnected, who love our democracy but didn't have time to read the 820-page House Select Committee report on the insurrection. And so we created a comic book as a vehicle because pop culture has, when it's done right and is entertaining, which I hope this is, has the power to reach across divisions of age and demographics and ideology and to move people. It has the ability, and we saw the passing of Norman Lear just recently, someone who recognized that humor and entertainment and engagement can cause people to have empathy with folks who they didn't think they shared values with, and to lower some of their barriers and actually hear new truths. A very quick story that I'll tell you. So I've been now to 4 Comic-Cons in the last 6 months. Well, if people who know me know I did not need an excuse to go to a Comic-Con. But at Baltimore Comic-Con, I was at a table with the book. Gentleman came up to me with his son. The gentleman had his Yoda backpack, baby Yoda backpack, and his son was dressed as Darth Vader, which maybe should have tipped me off. And he said, "This book looks great, really interesting. I want to buy it. Were you there? Where did the idea come from?" And I said, "Well, we interviewed a lot of people." And he said, "Well, I was there." I said, "Really? What were you doing there?" He said, "Well, the president told me to come." Yeah. And so I went. And I saw him speak at the Ellipse, and he told us to go to the Capitol, and so I went. And there were other people starting to break into, and by the way, he took out his phone and showed us a bunch of photos of himself at the Capitol on January 6th. And he kept saying, "I don't usually talk about this." I'm thinking, dude, we just met. Well, and by the way, I was dressed as a Union officer from the Civil War because Comic-Con. So he showed me these photos. He said he was about to break into the Capitol with his cohort, and a woman who he had come on the bus with said, we got kids at home. I don't think we should do this. I think we're going to get in trouble. And he said the fever broke, or that particular fever broke, and he didn't do it. And he said a number of people he came down there with were prosecuted. He found himself looking over his shoulder for a year, he told me, expecting the FBI to break down his door. But according to his telling of the story, he didn't do it because someone who he trusted was able to speak reason to him in that moment. Now, he did not say to me, and I now realize that everything I believed was wrong, but I could see that he was struggling with where the truth lay. And importantly, how else would I have had a 20-minute conversation with an insurrectionist that was civilized, that was where we shared values and shared enthusiasm about a pop culture vehicle? Last part of the story is that, so he bought a copy and he left, and I thought, man, I hope he doesn't read this thing before I get out of here. And about 10 minutes later, he came back. And I thought, what's going to happen? And he said, could you sign this for me? And I signed it, and he was off. So did I change his worldview forever? I don't know. But I think I had a chance. And it's a chance that I would not have had if I had only written that law review article read by tens of people in dark rooms.
Well, it seems to me, Alan, that you should join me in my RV Lucille as I go around the country, because those are exactly the conversations that I have, sitting around having a beer with the guys on the campground who are largely Trump supporters and endorsers, and the conversation that is actually, it is a conversation and not about changing minds, but about figuring out, what's going on in the country. And I think that we need to have more of those conversations as friends, as neighbors, as members of a community, because we demonstrate by that we can have civilized conversations without resorting to violence.
I'm on board, and you know this, Donna, of course, but a way to think about it is camping is culture.
Right.
There's a camping culture, and I do a lot of camping,
Believe me.
including last summer, and in which I was roasting marshmallows with folks that had Confederate flags on their trailers and all kinds of things. Did we change each other's worldview forever? Probably not. But we brought humanity, and the kind of humanity that at its best makes the idea of violence impossible. So I'm with you.
Let me praise you both, but also problematize this. Alan, it took you 20 minutes and a comic book. Donna, it takes you door to door in an RV. Meanwhile, one of the people in the audience, Brad Fitch, who is president of the Congressional Management Foundation, sent me an article over the weekend saying, you're going to talk about political violence. Maybe you read this, and it was in Vox. I don't know if you all saw it, but it was just over the weekend. And one of the sections of that article describes the ways in which, in party, the threats of violence are used, not so much kinetically to threaten other side, but to keep people in line. So self-policing, if you will. I mean, is there any hope for culture to undermine, overcome, mitigate that? Either of you.
Such a good question. Look, I do think, if you talk offline with some of my former colleagues who voted not to certify the election on January 6th, they will tell you that they felt like they had to do it. Not that they believed it, not that they subscribed to it, but they felt that they had to do it. I think that is a problem when elected officials are policing themselves in order not to feel those threats of violence. I mean, we've heard reports of members who voted not to certify the election who say that they did so because they felt that their family might be threatened. It's changed their behavior. Look, the reality is that we can't have 20-minute conversations with 300 million Americans to change their minds. But each of us in our individual communities and spaces can have those conversations. And I think it's incumbent on us to do it. And who's best positioned to do that, frankly, are our leaders.
Yeah, I would just add to your question, Brad, is there hope? Absolutely. I think, I agree with Alex that it's crucial for leaders, for in-party leaders, as you described, to be speaking out and condemning violence and also resolving tough questions in ways that do not use violence. It's also true that we're all part of multiple communities. Right? We're part of families, we're part of our neighborhood, we're part of our faith tradition or our camping culture or our comic book culture. And those are also all places where we need to make sure we're pulling people towards democratic values and equal dignity when, whether it's a political figure or someone else is thinking about the consequences of how they vote or what they do or say. They're certainly thinking about their political community, but they're probably also thinking, well, what's my faith community going to have to say to me about what I'm about to do? What are the folks who I go camping with every Sunday? I'm going to be accountable to them as well and have to explain myself. And so the political sector is crucial, and we need to demand and expect leadership and integrity there. It's also the case that we're part of lots of other communities, and I think we need to engage with the right values in those communities as well.
Well, here's a reality check. If a quarter of Americans believe that, or nearly a quarter believe that political violence is an answer or a response, that means that 75% of us don't. And so whenever I see these numbers, I have to remind myself about the 75%, because that means that the overwhelming majority of us have a different kind of responsibility and response, and we can't be afraid to step up. And frankly, it's those numbers that have tamped down political violence in the past, and we need to begin to exercise our power and our ability to have those conversations with our neighbors.
Alex.
When you research what I research, you get the opportunity to be a real bummer a lot of the time, both in the media, but also just in conversations with friends. And so I'm going to do that a little bit right now. One of the problems is that the nature of polarization today, and partly the reason we have this affective polarization that we have, is because party identity has become sorted with all of these other communities that you're talking about, right? So there is still some overlap, what we call cross-cutting identities, but partisanship is now correlated at a very high level with all sorts of things that have nothing to do with politics, right? And so there are fewer opportunities for those types of interactions. People saying, oh, well, what does my faith-based community think about this? Well, for most people, it thinks exactly what they think, and that's part of the challenge. Now, that's normal. Polarization is totally normal. It was weird, the period of politics that I grew up with, and that most of you in this room are sort of old enough to remember, where ideology wasn't even that correlated with your partisanship, right? That was weird. That was a leftover, basically, of the Civil War, right? And the fact that party identity is such a strong, lasting attachment. But it's much more normal when you have two parties for people to split into groups that are correlated with their ideology, with their worldview, with their race, their education level, all of these things. And so that's the really challenging thing that we face in this current moment. And that's why it's so important that the elites on the side where violence is happening immediately sort of saying, no, we can't have this. Because yes, maybe it's only 25%. In fact, I think it's less of people who think consciously violence is okay, violence is an option that's available to me. Most people aren't paying that much attention to politics right now. The problem is, by not paying attention to politics, they engage in this kind of blind partisanship. They just go with what their side says. And when you go with what your side says, you eventually normalize dehumanization, you normalize violence, to a point where it just becomes part of our political culture, and that's what we have to avoid.
Let me pursue you just for a moment. I'm not sure about how I language that, but if you read the smart articles about political violence these days, there's always a section in it that where someone says, historically America has always had political violence, which is absolutely true, and we've written violence on so many aspects of our society in ways that we have not even yet begun to talk about today yet, but I believe we will, I hope. What do you say, though, to the statement, well, we've always had this kind of political violence, and yet here we are. What's different now? I start with Alex, and then Donna or Alan.
Well, so we have always had political violence. The difference, and we've always had polarization, by the way, right? Lots of polarization about the Vietnam War. Lots of polarization about race relations in our country, about civil rights. Lots of polarization about issues related to women, et cetera. Always been a lot of polarization, but it used to play out across the parties and within the parties. It wasn't partisan polarization, and partisan polarization has a very different flavor. And the reason for that, the thing that keeps people like me up at night, people who study polarization, is there's this concern that because democracy becomes the target of partisan polarization, elections become caught in the crossfire, that we start seeing this incentive to deny the results of an election, right? To push as hard as you can to steal an election, which is what January 6th was, the culmination of an effort to steal a presidential election. It was a ham-handed effort, but we can't count on all of them being that. And so that's the concern, is that it leads to this incentive to try to undermine democracy, and most people aren't paying attention, and maybe we gradually whittle away at some of the norms and some of the institutions that keep our democracy going until by the time everyone's paying attention, it's too late. You can't say anything. We're Hungary, we're Turkey. And so that's the big concern, is that partisan polarization and the violence that it begets is just different in kind from nonpartisan polarization, because our system is so based on parties, despite the fact that our founders were skeptical of parties.
Mm-hmm. Alan, what's different now?
Well, I don't know if it's different. I think an additional dynamic is that white supremacy has metastasized at a national level that we haven't seen for a long time. It's certainly not new, but that we haven't seen for a long time. So, again, I'll harken back to that period between Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction of the Civil Rights Movement, where you had plenty of political violence and personal violence, and it was used to deny the franchise, to overturn elections, there was a coup that occurred in the southern states over that period. But most of us I spent most of my life as a civil rights lawyer, we always thought, well, white folks won't do that to each other. And now they are. And white supremacy continues to be a significant driver of that, ironically. That violence, often white-on-white violence, political violence, that is driven in significant part by white supremacy and white nationalism and Christian nationalism, that in my view has metastasized in a way that, the people like Martin Luther King Jr. warned would happen, that this isn't only about black folks, that if American society does not step back from the use of violence and the rampant bigotry and misinformation and lies, it's going to come back to challenge our very democracy itself. And I think that's what's different, is that we're now seeing that our nation is on the brink of just that kind of a challenge.
Donna Edwards, as a leader, is courage even possible anymore?
Well, I mean, I think in a room like this and otherwise, we have to say yes, because if we don't, then it means that we've given up the store. And I don't think I'm willing to do that. And I think, part of what the difference today is in recent years is the tacit and open endorsement by leaders who have a microphone, a megaphone, to join in with the forces who believe that violence is acceptable. And that is really different. And I think that the courage has to come from within the party dynamics, where you have leaders within the parties. And what we've seen is that when there are leaders in their party who step up and say no, they are just, quickly ousted. I mean, we could start, a running list of those who basically run away, for example, from the Republican Party. I mean, I would urge people, and I talk to a lot of folks who say, I'm no longer a part of the Republican Party, or they've become independents. I say, stay in the fight, stay in the party, and just, to try to rebuild some semblance of a party that really is a viable opposition party with the Democratic Party. I mean, it doesn't do any of us any good just to have a conversation with ourselves. And it's easy now to do that because, our social media lends to that. If you just want to find people who think like you do and talk with those people, totally easy to do. And so unless our leadership are having that conversation across these lines, then I think it makes it really difficult to find the courage to step outside of those party definitions. And I worry that too many of our leaders or people who are in political leadership positions really step back because they're afraid of being ostracized by their colleagues.
Alex.
Yeah, to that point, I conducted a survey with the UMass poll of the membership of the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress that Donna is vice president of, and we had a great response. Almost 300 former members responded. And what you see there is a real disconnect between the Republican former members of Congress and the Republican electorate, and also the public stances of current Republican elected officials. 82% of the respondents said that they believe Joe Biden's election was legitimate. That compares to like 25% of Republican voters. 64% told us that they believe Donald Trump's efforts to claim he won the election are a threat to democracy. This is among Republican former members of Congress, and I conducted this poll. This is not a bunch of rhinos. These are people who, a lot of them are still active in the party, who if you focused on what they did, these were staunch conservative, very partisan Republicans. And so 64% told us that Donald Trump's efforts to claim he won the election are a threat to democracy. That compares to like less than 20% among voters. They were much more likely to describe January 6th as an insurrection or a riot. Very few voters do that. And so there is a group out there who have not been drinking the Kool-Aid. And yes, as Donna points out, they get expelled, right? It's hard to believe a Liz Cheney, right, with the last name Cheney in Wyoming, basically gets kicked out of the Republican Party. But she's had an impact, right? Hearing that maybe, provides some backbone to some Republicans who are in office today. And certainly there are people out there who are in the rank and file of the Republican Party who are not, in the sort of MAGA group, who hear that and say, you know what, I can still be a Republican without believing this stuff.
Well, and it's a reminder to us, and thanks, Alex, for the survey, that your data show that the importance of elevating those voices, and they're, these former members are all across the country. They span a wide range of the time that they spent in Congress, and their voices are really important, and they don't carry what is the mainstream of the elected Republican leadership now, but they still are really important voices in their communities, in their districts, in their states, and in terms of influencing current members of Congress.
In the 90 seconds we have left, Alan, one policy that we can enact now to help mitigate political violence, and then a call to action from you, Donna Edwards.
All right, I'm going to try to talk fast. So
yes.
We partnered with Western States Center on the comic book, and so there's a free education and action guide that readers can download. Solutions, I'm going to say, don't bring a PowerPoint to a culture war. We need to get engaged. We need our everyday folks to get engaged at the local level as well as at the national and policy level, to be attending town hall meetings and supporting librarians and vulnerable folks, transgender folks and migrants and others in their local communities. There are a lot of things, read the guide, that everyday folks can do. And then, of course, accountability matters. And so, we're in a national debate about whether there should be political and potentially legal liability and accountability for inciting political violence. And I think we need to, insist that the answer is yes.
Donna Edwards, what is your call to action?
Wow. First of all, this is a really important year, and it's going to be a defining moment for our democracy and for us deciding whether we're going to hold on to our institutions. And I think, like Alan and Alex have said, that nobody is exempt from your responsibility to do something. And that something can be signing up to be a poll worker, working in your local elections, running for political office at every single level, and then calling on all of us and our leaders to uphold our democracy. I mean, we have something that's worth holding on to. The world is watching us. And and I think that, when I think about from now until Election Day are going to be some of the most vulnerable pressure points that we've ever faced in this country. And I know that, people are fond of saying that this is the most important election of our lifetime. Well, I'm going to say it. This is the most important election of our lifetime. And it's up to us to figure out what it is that we're going to leave for that next generation, and not a single one of us is exempt from what it is that we need to do. So let's get on with it.
Please join me in thanking this amazing panel. And now I will invite you to exit stage left.